Welcome back to the Village Bonfire for another episode of the Wild Sacred Journey podcast. A podcast not just for your mind, but for your body and spirit too. Here we don't just talk theory. Instead, we compassionately engage with our lived experiences and a wide variety of topics together, all to invite the question, in these times we find ourselves in, how do we be more human? Thank you for being here. May these conversations awaken, inspire, repair, and evolve something deep within each of us and serve the wild, tender aliveness of our personal and collective hearts. Welcome back to another episode of the Wild Sacred Journey podcast. So we've got another solo episode with me today, and hopefully I'm hoping to get some more conversations coming back soon. But between kind of coming back from this big 4-month trip and then, getting sick right away. If you listen to the last episode, you'll kind of hear about my experience coming back and just getting sick right in time for the holidays. And then that's kind of, re-entry or landing after an experience like that can be, it's always a little challenging. And there was some like perfect storm of like the holidays and getting sick and then, and then the re-entry that just really has kind of taken me out. So anyway, got another solo episode and I think this one will kind of just be a little bit of a short and sweet episode, but sometimes when I get going, I find I have more to say than I think I do. So we'll see how it goes. So before we get into it, we're going to light our candle. Spark the village fire. And start to gather and settle, coming closer to the light, to the warmth, to each other in whatever way that looks like, wherever we're listening from. Taking a few breaths in and out. This idea of gathering together has felt really potent for me in this sort of re-entry, landing, integration process. Because there were several days after I was physically better from being sick, but where I had really spiraled into some places, into a way of being that I haven't been in for quite a while now. And it was pretty similar to where I was when I started this, more of my, what I would call a spiritual journey, I guess, or sort of my healing journey, whatever we want to call it. And it was interesting kind of being a little bit more conscious in that space and being able to track some of that a little bit more. And I was just really aware how it was like I couldn't feel my body. And my thoughts were just stuck in this same loop. It was not a pretty loop. It was a very mean to myself loop. And it was like, I've gotten very used to in the kinds of work that I do and just in the training that I've had, and then in the practice and the devotion I have to that path for myself and for people who choose to work with me or really anybody in my life. Who's, anyone who's my ripples reach. I've gotten used to just kind of feeling myself as part of that web and really being able to feel the subtle flows of energy in and out of myself and in relationship to the environment around me and the people around me, and to feel the guiding, teaching energies that I work with and consciousnesses that gift me with their presence, humble me with their presence. I'm some part of me is sort of constantly attuned to them in ways that I think I've actually, I take for granted sometimes. And I couldn't feel any of that. It was like my entire world had collapsed down into my mind and the thoughts that were in it. And I didn't even really have access to my body. And it was so dark and so lonely and isolated feeling. And, and so I share all that just because, it's fresh for me in a way that, like I said, I haven't felt that way in a while. And so yeah, it was very interesting to kind of be taken back and to also watch where then I like wanted to start judging myself for ending up back there again, and like, how are we back here again? And then also that like it was almost harder being there, like both easier and harder being there, knowing what else is possible. But there were a couple things that I was really sort of tracking and sitting with. And so one of those was like I said, this idea of gathering and sort of this sense of like just really being reinforced, like how much more we struggle and how much more our struggle becomes that we turn it inward and it becomes self-wounding and like self-inflicting when we feel disconnected and isolated from other people, from life, from things that just kind of help check that voice. And I remember a turning point was after a couple of days of just like being in that place and just really just tending myself as best I could while I was in that place. There was a turning point where I was able to kind of widen just a little bit beyond my mind, beyond that sense. And I could feel this gentle web, ocean, basket, whatever metaphor, of just gentle benevolence, of gentle love, waiting for me. And I could feel people, both generally and actually some specific people in my life who I know care about me deeply. And, who have since mentioned to me, like, oh, I've been thinking about you a lot these last couple of weeks. And I'm like, oh, yeah, I could feel that. But, we're just sending a lot of love my direction. And it just shifted something because it was like, oh, yes, there it is. Like, there is a belonging here for me. Because, man, my head was not finding that, right? Belonging doesn't happen in our mind. It happens through our bodies and more specifically through our heart centers. And so, yeah, so that's one piece that I was kind of tracking. And then this other piece that I was I was tracking a lot of different pieces, but sort of two major ones that kind of came out for me to speak to today, because I also have been hearing a lot too from clients and friends. I've been making more of an effort since I started turning the corner to then like reach out with people and be like, hey, I need a little connection right now, And when I do reach out to some of the people and ask that, like, it's been interesting to me too, how many people are like, oh man, this last week has been really rough for me too. Or, I'm just really going through some stuff. And I think sort of the end of the year, that like period of sort of reflection on what was and what we hope will be, right? Like that tension between the ground we're standing on and where we hope to be, right? That tension between the uncomfortable learning invitations and the rewards that we hope will come, right? Tension between longing and belonging, gets really heightened, I think, in many ways at this time of year. So yeah, so there's that piece. But then the piece about gathering to support sort of some of that isolation, to support some of that um, to check ourselves really, like, our mind has one way of seeing the world and it feels very real to us in the moment. And it may not be at all real, like when it comes up against the outside world. Right. And so, we have to find that balance between honoring what we feel to be true, right? Like not giving that power away and allowing ourselves to be swayed by everything and everyone that we encounter. And at the same time, also knowing when to check ourselves. Like, hey, my mind's telling me this story, and that feels very real to me. And, that may not, like, what are you seeing in this story? Like, how is this thing that's happening? Like, how are you interpreting that? Like, what are you seeing here? And then, again, listening in to what the other person's saying, like, is that true for us? Is it not? But it's good to check ourselves sometimes, and particularly when the voices in our head are caught in some of those really um dark, suffering, disconnected feedback loops. So yeah, and then the other piece, the major piece that I was tracking is this piece about then with the big emotions, how are we navigating them, right? And with the really messy ones. And, I was noticing just how quickly I went to wanting to fix it and to wanting to be through it and to wanting to this and to wanting to that, right? And and also noticing too, like how easy it is to disconnect in that place. Like, where's that point where we're taking responsibility, right? We're not just like spewing whatever messy, big feelings we're having at the moment at the people around us to the best of our abilities, which usually isn't perfect. Um, so there's a certain amount of like taking responsibility, but not isolating, right? Like not reinforcing that sense that we're completely alone and we have to go through this alone and it's a punishment because all of this is messy and wrong and blah, 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 right? And so that balance of like, when do we reach out and when do we sit in it? And I think I know that's been a huge learning process for me and an ongoing one. And I think it is for a lot of people because most of us did not receive maybe the mirroring or the validation and also the checking that we needed in the ways that we needed it when we had big feelings when we were younger, you know. Some variation often, we would receive some variation often of like either people telling us to get over it or telling us to come back when we could, you know, behave ourselves or be pleasant or whatever, right? Or just leaving us, um, or shutting it down in some way or deflecting it in some way, and usually that had more to do with the capacity of the person that we were, you know, interacting with at the time and sort of receiving and internalizing these messages from. Um, or even maybe if they were attempting to be supportive, that it just, for whatever reason, we internalized it as like, that's too big, that's too much, that's too messy, that's too this, that's too that, right? And so then we don't learn how to hold those things, those big feelings, and be in relationship in a way that's responsible, not bullying, not manipulative, not just like spewing everywhere, right? And so, yeah, so there's an element too of sort of tending to it ourselves in those moments with like the compassion that we needed and didn't receive, or wanted and didn't receive, or didn't receive in the ways that we were able to receive it. Um, and yeah, and sort of being able to like validate ourselves, like, okay, yeah, this is really big.
and this feels really real. And like, that's okay. And it may not be the whole world, it may not be the whole truth, but like in this moment, this is really big and important. And that's valid, you know? So, which kind of brings me yeah. So this piece that then also kind of shifted for me. So back when I first earlier on in kind of this like homecoming journey, this journey back to myself, as it were, I remember I was on my yoga mat and I was going through a yoga asana flow. And we were in Shavasana at the end of class. And I really like when I first started practicing yoga, I mean, anytime my head was below my heart, I'd start crying. um, there was a lot of emotion that had been stored in my body, not processed through, that then started to come out when I started to move my body in those ways and in those shapes and postures. And so I remember I was laying in Shavasana and I had this very clear image come to me of like my body was this clay shell and there were all these cracks in it and they were just starting to come apart. And I had this moment where my first instinct was to try and pull them all back together again. Like, oh my God, something's wrong. Right. And and I was actually able in that moment, there was like enough clarity that this deeper, wiser voice was able to come through me in that moment and sort of say, well, wait a minute, why are we? It's not like life's working right now. Like, it's not like things are good. Your relationships are not good. You're not happy. You're not healthy, right? Like, why are we trying to pull it all back together again and keep it like this, right? Like, what would happen? What might be there if you let those cracks widen and let it fall apart? And so I got curious and I was able to just be like, okay, I don't know, but let's try it and see. And I had this clear image of, yeah, like the clay, the cracks just got so wide. And what was there was just the brightest and most beautiful light I'd ever seen. And so, of course, I cried. Did a lot of crying. I do a lot of crying. It's part of how I process things. Um, and and it reminds me in some ways of that Leonard Cohen song, there's a crack in everything. That's how the light gets in, right? But it's also like how the light gets out, right? And so as I'm sitting here in this dark place for the last like week or so, and then even now that, again, like I said, I've turned a corner and kind of have come out of that, I've still been kind of bouncing back and forth a little bit between, sort of this much more expanded version of me that I found on my travels, and then kind of this like pre-travel version of me that I'm um yeah, still doing a little bit of bouncing back and forth between those, although I think something deeper shifted today. And I think we might be finally coming out the other side of even that, but we'll see. Um, but as I've been sitting in that place, I just was so aware that underneath so many of these emotions, the anger, the bullying, the frustration, the sadness and depression and the meanness and the judgment, and like underneath all of that, all of the different permutations of it was like actually heartbreak, right? And I see that a lot in myself, and I see that with clients, that often underneath most things there's a heartbreak happening. And the other things are usually a way that we're trying to protect ourselves from the heartbreak. And so, in the same way that I was like noticing how quickly I wanted to try and fix my big emotions or like get away from them, I was noticing how much I was trying to protect myself from heartbreak. And so I had that memory of that moment in Shavasana on my yoga mat come back to me. And I was sitting with that and I was like, wait a minute, like, yeah, like, okay, my heart's breaking. But what happens if I like let that happen, you know? And what I realized in that moment, it was like a little bit of a perspective shift that really spoke to me. And so I offer it in case it kind of speaks to you. But, our true hearts are, like we always say, oh, there's no perfection in the world, right? Like, stop trying for perfection, right? But our true hearts, like our true, innocent, pure, tender, vulnerable hearts, those are actually perfect, right? The organizing force in the universe, the organizing energy and consciousness in the universe is love. And there are a lot of days and times and situations where it's really hard to feel that and see that, because there's a lot of fear. There's a lot of patternings that we develop to protect ourselves from the loss of love, right? Like, we're constantly in this space, this sort of healthy tension, unavoidable healthy tension of being between love and loss, right? Love and absence, expansion and contraction, right? And those are balancing forces of the universe. So they're always going to be there. But as we try to, in our fear of the loss, in our fear of the contraction, in our fear of the things that hurt, we often end up actually cutting ourselves off from love, because we're also afraid, because the more expansive we get, sometimes the harder that pendulum swing back happens, right? Like, which is some of what I've been talking about with this trip, right? Real big expansion on my trip. And then, like, pendulum didn't just like swing back to center. It went like way back, like way, way back, like being teenager again, So the more we expand, the more we expand our capacity to feel that bliss, to feel that love, to feel that tenderness, right? To feel held by all of that, the more we're going to also feel loss. And yet it's, the amount of loss that we feel is often softened by the amount of love that we feel, but the fear is still there. So we're often actually afraid of feeling love, right? Of feeling the expansion, because then we know we might lose it, right? The higher you climb, the more it's going to hurt when you fall, because you've got further to fall, right? That's what our head tells us, which isn't necessarily true. It's not necessarily that linear. But that's sort of usually where we get a lot of that patterning. So, but our true hearts, then, since if the organizing force of the universe is love, then our true hearts, not the walls we've put around them or the protections we've tried to put in place around them, those are more fear-based, but our true hearts are actually perfect, which means they don't have design flaws. So, because as I'm sitting here and I'm like feeling all the ways in which my heart is like just breaking, and I'm feeling all the ways that those quote unquote fault lines, right? The weak points in my heart, how, it's the same types of places, the same types of situations that my heart wants to break in, like again and again and again, right? And so as I'm sitting there and as I'm tracking that, and as I'm tending to that, and as I'm feeling that, I was like, but wait a minute, if the heart is perfect, then why am I talking about these things as like fault lines or as like weaknesses, right? Like design flaws, right? And because I found myself thinking like, oh my gosh, why is my heart like have these particular design flaws, which then cause it to like break all the time? And I like caught myself thinking that. And I was like, well, that's kind of a weird thing to think, because if our hearts are perfect, and I do truly believe that, then those aren't design flaws. So that means that those places, those quote unquote weak places where my heart seems to break all the time, those specific things that seem to really get into my heart, then there's actually a sacredness there. There's actually a holiness there. And some kind of purpose. And that somehow ties into what my medicine is, what my part of tending to our collective nervous system, of tending to our collective wounds is. The part that's mine to take responsibility for are the places that my heart is designed to break in. And that every time my heart breaks in those places, there's an opportunity there for something of beauty to be let out, actually, into the world, in and out. Something to be transmuted. And the heart is malleable too. So a lot of times when something feels like it's really broken, like really sharp edges, right? Then it might not actually be the heart. It might actually be one of those protections we put in place around the heart, one of the walls, one of the things that's more rigid in structure. And I feel that a lot as I've sort of moved somewhat along this path, I guess, in sort of in subtlety or in nuance in this type of work and with myself, is that when my heart breaks now, usually, except in moments where I'm like, somehow like my 15-year-old self is completely reactivated and like I'm in her dark places. When my heart breaks, there is this sense of just, malleability. There's a softness to the edges. It isn't this like shattering sensation. It's more just this ache that feels more like a stretch, actually, than like a shattering. So yeah, that's not to say that we should stay in situations or excuse people which like break our hearts repeatedly, right? Like there's a discernment there that needs to happen. I'm not saying that like we should be actively seeking out being brokenhearted all the time, but more that there can be a lightness as we tend to those heartbreaks, that maybe it isn't the earth-shattering, life-ending pain and suffering that some part of us thinks it is or fears it is, right? That maybe we don't need to be protecting ourselves from our path and from being alive by trying to protect ourselves from heartbreak, right? Because heartbreak's inevitable and not a design flaw. It actually brings us into more contact with our aliveness. And then too, like I said, in these times, especially then when we're looking around at the world around us and just how much heartbreak there is in the world, it's so easy to think, oh, I need to like go out there and do this and do that. And like, yes, take action, right? Like, thoughts and prayers aren't enough. We know that, right? There's something, and they're not nothing. They are very important, and they're not the only piece. We also need to take action in the physical world. But, a lot of times it can feel like there's so much pain and there's so much suffering and there's so much that we care about and that we want to take care of, right? And, and in order to avoid burnout and really be in it for the long haul, be available for chronic compassion, right? Then, we need to be discerning about what is our piece to play. And what if the piece we have to bring is actually the part where our heart breaks the most, right? So then our heartbreak actually becomes a tool of discernment. What, rather than just kind of a general sadness, I feel, what is the specific piece of this that just kills me, right? Like that just makes my whole chest feel like it's exploding you know? And then that's where we start to tend that within ourselves. And then we can tend that in some way in the world. So, yeah, just feeling into whether there's anything else I feel like I need to say in this moment about this subject. I think not. I think I'm just going to leave it there. Um, yeah. Yeah, I think we'll leave it there for now. So gathering big emotions, heartbreak, and just the necessity of those things in these times and for ourselves, and reweaving ourselves back into a knowing that we belong, a knowing that we have something of value to bring, a knowing that our hearts are perfectly designed, even in the ways that they are quote unquote weak. And yeah, and also just that, you know, I have the skills in this moment to go through some of these places that I went through alone. Um, and I, even in those dark places where I felt really disconnected, was able to really keep checking in. Like, do I need help with this? Do I need outside support with this? And to trust the answer that I was getting, because I know how to discern between that reactive isolationist voice, or I've gotten a lot better. I shouldn't say I know how, still learning, but gotten a lot better at discerning between that sort of reactionary isolationist voice. Um, the one that thinks I need to go it alone because I can't ask for help, or I shouldn't ask for help, or no one can help me, or whatever, right? Like that voice. So I know now what that one is versus the voice that's like, no, we're actually okay and we can't fix this. We just need to like be with this for a little bit, because whatever's happening in this moment is alchemical and will be transmuted, but we just need to be with it. So I'm in a place where I can draw that distinction, and where I could trust myself even in the darkness to be able to track that. So that's the only other thing I would say too, is you don't need to go, if what I'm sharing about that darkness is really resonating for you, you don't need to go through that alone. If you don't feel like you have the skills, or you don't feel like you have quite enough of a widened perspective to be able to kind of get yourself out of that, or you just want to be held in that moment, and like that's okay too, right? Like sometimes we need being held from people we care about, and more like peers or friends or family or loved ones of whatever kind. And sometimes we need being held by professional, someone who has some training and can help us, train ourselves in tools and skills to navigate those spaces. Um, and sometimes people need medications to also help them, like get enough of a break that they can start to kind of widen their perspective. So, um, you know, just a reminder that whatever you need to take care of yourself is valid, and a good starting off point, and then be open to the journey from there. But get yourself to a place where you can, where it doesn't feel like too much, where you're not re-traumatizing yourself with what's happening. Yeah. We'll wrap there for today. So just going to drop a little deeper into that heart space frequency, that true heart. And as you're listening to this, wherever you are, notice perhaps if you can feel that as I shift. And usually it'll show up in your body in some way. Your breathing pattern might change, or some muscles might relax. And if you can't feel it, that's okay too. Or if you can feel it, but it feels so alien or so far away that you can't get there, that's all right. Just do your best. In this moment. And then perhaps today we offer something to our fire. You can imagine blowing it into the fire. You can imagine dropping it into the fire. If you have a candle or a fire nearby, you can use your fire. But just anything that you feel intuitively is ready to be transmuted. And so we offer that to the fire. Hungry, hungry fire. Let it transmute something. And with deep gratitude, take a nice full breath in, a full breath out, knowing that that transmutation might take a little bit longer than what I just left time for, but we don't need to sit here in silence for too long, at least in a podcast episode, maybe in a group setting. Thank you so much for tuning back in today. Thank you for tuning in whenever and wherever you do. It really does mean the world to me. To know that these conversations are perhaps reaching you, touching you, supporting you in some way. And thank you for your support. Thank you for any shares or any ratings or any other ways that you feel like you can and will and want to support the podcast. And just continuing to have conversations like this. And like I said, I'm hoping to get back to having conversations with other people at some point, but it's also been kind of a good challenge for me to share some more of my voice, some more of my story. So, all right. Well, be well, and see you next time around the fire. Hi, Kate here again. Thank you for gathering with us. Whether you've been here a while or found your way here thanks to today's guest, it means so much to me and the world I dream of to have you here. I hope you'll tune in for more of our conversations. We humans seem to be at a profound threshold and facing questions of deep impact for the future and the world. We need our full hearts and humanity as we sow seeds of change in these times of joy and heartbreak. I count myself lucky to be here now, around this virtual village fire, weaving our stories into a medicine with humans like you. As a community medicine space, this podcast is relational. It weaves webs of connection and mutual respect and care across time and space. If you appreciate and support the future we're seeding here, you can support the weaving of this web in a few ways. 1, share episodes with friends and family or online with your community. It also helps the podcast immensely if you like, rate, subscribe to, or follow the podcast where you watch or listen, so you get notified when new episodes drop and new listeners find us as they search. 2, join us on Patreon. Doing so supports conversations like the one you just heard and allows you access to live community gatherings and medicine circles and more as we continue to grow. It also helps me keep the space advertisement free so the conversations stay intact as they are.
If you have questions, suggestions, connections, or would like to find out more about working with me, you can find me online at www.wildsacredjourney.com, on Instagram at wildsacredjourney_KP, or email me, kate@wildsacredjourney.com. Until next time, from my heart to yours, I release today's fire with a prayer for our individual and collective wholeness, connection, and joy. May it be so.